The desire, when it left Massachusetts to go to the West Indies, actually had and part of its cargo were Pequot captives, which were exchanged for the enslaved African man that came back. This tells us something. It tells us that slavery served a double purpose in the colonization of New England. It was not just about labor, after all. Slavery served the purpose of removing indigenous people from their land, whether to be held on English farms or to be sold out of the region entirely away from their homeland. That, of course, opened the land to English settlement.
This program had gone viral, and there was some possibility that there were going to be 4,000 of you. We don't own that many chairs. So this is Jared Hardesty, second time here, although the last time was a wonderful workshop for those of us who work or volunteer in museums and talking about how to talk about slavery in New England in New England's museums. And it was an absolutely fascinating program. We also co-sponsored a book talk on his book on freedom, which darn, I'm sorry to say we don't have any copies of today. We're here though to talk about his latest book, which from all indications around here is going to be a bestseller because it has been very popular. Jared's an associate professor at Western Washington University, but he's also spent time on this coast. Got his PhD at Boston University. Boston College, apologies.
Go Eagles.
Go Eagles, apologies. And we're delighted to welcome you back.
Thank you. And first, I have to thank the Royall House, who's long been a friend. I consider them a friend of mine, and especially to allow me to talk about my new book, especially on this topic in this space, is really remarkable. This is a very powerful space in so many ways, being the only freestanding slave quarters north of the Mason-Dixon line. So to be in this space to talk about the book is powerful, and I'm very excited to speak here. I have to say thanks to my graduate advisor, Lynn Lyerly, who's in the back, and did decide to attend Boston College. And finally, I want to thank all of you. As Grace Law mentioned, this event went viral. Over about 4,000 people expressed interest in coming. And not only did it make me feel like a minor, about D-list celebrity, but it also really hit home for me the desire of people to learn about this subject, to dig more into this, into the past, into this history of slavery in New England. And so it really made the work I do feel rewarding. Sometimes when we're writing, we're stuck in our ivory towers as historians. We lose sight that people do care about this knowledge and they have a thirst for that knowledge. And so that was really amazing to me to see that sort of response. So thank you all. And it is my great honor to be speaking here about my new book, Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, A History of Slavery in New England, published by Brightleaf, which is the regional trade imprint of the University of Massachusetts Press. The book is the first general overview of slavery in New England in nearly 80 years. The last book to do this was a historian by the name of Lorenzo Johnston Green, and his book's titled The Negro in Colonial New England, published in 1942. It's a wonderful book, but it is a bit dated now. It's also a bit long. It's about 350 pages long. In the meantime, between 1942 and now, there's been plenty of books that explore slavery in New England, but they're usually part of a larger history of slavery in the United States, or slavery in the American North sometimes, or they're part of a focused historical study. So we don't really get a book that focuses exclusively on slavery in New England, and that's what I do here in the book. This evening, I want to do two things. I want to discuss the purpose of writing this book, or in other words, why I think we need this book at this moment, and then give you a brief overview of the contents of the book. And in doing so, I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about the history of slavery in New England, so you kind of get the narrative arc of the book and learn a bit about the history of slavery in New England more generally. So why write this book at this time? In the end, I view the book as a conversation. Or rather more me narrating a conversation that's been going on for the past 25 years. In that time period, over the past generation or so, there's been a massive outpouring of scholarship, books, journal articles, things like that, by academics on the topic of New England slavery. Much of that scholarship, and I'm totally guilty here, has been hyper-specialized, focusing on particular places, moments, themes, or sets of sources. These works, as excellent as they are, sometimes make it difficult to see the bigger picture and are inaccessible for a number of reasons, namely paywalling. A lot of academic articles behind for-profit publishers, they're behind paywalls, and it makes it hard for the general public to have access to that knowledge. So academics are up to that. Meanwhile, libraries, archives, and historical societies across New England have identified collections they own related to slavery and made them widely available through a variety of means, through traditional publishing, books, and things like that, putting the documents online. But also, even in some cases, just digitizing their catalogs, their library catalogs, and providing subject, so you can keyword search and subject search slavery, and just to make those collections available to wider audiences. Add to that a historical reckoning over the past about 15 years or so by leading institutions across New England, such as Brown University's report on slavery and justice, exploring the university's ties to the slavery and the slave trade. Now that reckoning has extended to historic sites large and small. I was just at Old North Church last night talking about their connections with slavery, other universities, and local and state governments. There's this kind of thirst of these institutions to explore their own ties and histories of slavery in the region. And finally, and I would be remiss not to talk about this, the work of community activists, public historians, and independent researchers who are on the front lines doing this work day in and day out, and who have uncovered an incredible amount of source material on slavery and publicized those findings, especially online, on blogs and things like that, that's readily accessible, and have forced all of us, and I include myself in this, to acknowledge the region's history of and connection to slavery. And so that's been a really driving force behind this book. And so there's all these kind of conversations that are going on out there, and many different people talking to each other and with each other about the history of slavery in New England, the memory of that history, and the politics of that memory. In the book, I try to bring together these conversations and use them to narrate a new, more comprehensive, yet accessible history of New England slavery. In short, I stand on the shoulders of the people who've been in the trenches doing this work for the past generation. In that sense, I view the book as an end. It synthesizes 25 years of scholarship to more fully tell this history, but it's also a beginning. It provides a set of facts, a framework, and a starting point for future conversations. So how do I narrate the book? How do I write this history of slavery in New England? As the title implies, when writing the book, I wanted to be as comprehensive as possible. I discussed the lives of enslaved Africans and indigenous people in New England, how their enslavement was instrumental to the colonization of the region, and how slavery and colonization were two processes designed to transform New England into a place that best served the region's white settler population, especially the wealthiest inhabitants. All three of those are tall orders, but my editor said I had to do that in about 60,000 words, which is about 175 pages. And to make it as approachable for the reading public as possible. And so this was no small task. Indeed, the hardest part of writing this book was not what to research and write. I had 25 years of excellent source material from academics, researchers, and activists, after all. But rather, how? How do I write this book? How to create a book that is short yet comprehensive, comprehensive yet readable, readable yet sensitive to the subject matter. And now that the book's been published, I really hope I pulled it off. The book is both a chronological and topical narrative that opens with the colonization of New England in the 1620s and 30s and ends in the early 19th century by examining the process of emancipation. To provide some coherence to this overarching narrative, the book uses one organizing theme: connections. The connection between New England slavery and slave societies in other parts of the Americas, the connection of slavery in New England to the larger social, economic, and political development of the region, and how those two types of connections shape the lives of enslaved people and how enslaved people shape those connections. The book opens, chapter 1, there's a prologue about the Royall House and kind of setting the stage for the book where I talk about connections. But then the first chapter of the book opens by examining the connection between slavery and colonization. There were enslaved Africans in New England by the late 1630s, by about the mid 1630s. But the first documented arrival of Africans in New England was in 1638, when the ship called the Desire returned from the West Indies and carried a diverse cargo. And among those cargoes was an enslaved person, an enslaved African. But the story of the Desire, that's oftentimes the kind of starting point in histories of slavery in New England. The first enslaved person arrived in 1638. That's actually not the case. The history of the Desire and the ship Desire actually opens up this connection between slavery and colonization, because just 2 years prior to the arrival of that enslaved man on the Desire, New Englanders had begun to wage a war against a local indigenous group, the Pequot. It's called the Pequot War. It lasted from 1636 to 1638. And in that conflict, New Englanders captured hundreds of Pequot women, men, women, and children. Many of those Pequot captives were put to work on the farms across the region. The governor, John Winthrop, owned a couple Pequot captives. His son, John Winthrop Jr., owned a few Pequot captives. Some of them actually worked on what became the Royall estate, what was called Tin Hills Farm back then, before the Royals purchased the property. But many of those Pequot captives were sold out of the colony. And so the Desire, when it left Massachusetts to go to the West Indies, actually had in part of its cargo were Pequot captives, which were exchanged for the enslaved African man that came back. This tells us something. It tells us that slavery served a double purpose in the colonization of New England. It was not just about labor, after all. Slavery served the purpose of removing indigenous people from their land, whether to be held on English farms or to be sold out of the region entirely away from their homeland. That, of course, opened the land to English settlement. It allowed for the rapid expansion of English settlement into the region. Between the 1620s and 1630s, about 30,000 Puritans arrived here. It's the largest migration of free migration of people before the 19th century arrived here in New England, and they quickly spread throughout the region. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine is settled. And so this rapid expansion of English people, and they're using Indian wars and Indian captivity to remove, as one strategy of displacing and removing indigenous people from their land to open up for settlement. But the expansion's happening rapidly, very quickly, and it's creating labor shortages. It's outstripping the ability of New Englanders to work the land that they're settling and that they're colonizing. And so African slaves, enslaved Africans, could be used to address those labor shortages, to be brought in as supplemental labor forces, or in some of the major port cities as instrumental to the industries that are keeping the region's economy running. And so you see slavery serving the dual purpose here of removing indigenous people from their land, but also supplementing the actual colonization of the region using enslaved African labor and enslaved indigenous labor to a lesser extent. Central to this cycle of captive trading was New England's connection to the growing plantation economies of the West Indies. About the same time that Puritans arrived here in New England, English began colonizing the West Indies, namely the island of Barbados, but also Antigua, and a bit later, the island of Jamaica. These islands rapidly developed into sugar plantations that grew sugar. This was the lucrative crop of the 17th century and 18th century. And those sugar plantations were driven by enslaved African labor. They became the largest markets for New England exports. The agricultural surpluses, the corn, the apples, the salt pork, the salt beef, the timber, the codfish, the livestock that was raised here, all sent to the West Indies. It's the largest market, used to feed enslaved Africans and to help power the sugar plantation. So the New England literally fuels the plantation revolution of the West Indies and the rise of these large slave societies that become the kind of centerpiece of European, or especially Britain's, colonial holdings. And it's all, it's powered by New England and New England's exports. It creates a symbiotic relationship between the two regions, between New England and the Caribbean. And so you see them influencing each other, and not just in economic ways, right? The large trade, the amount of trade that's going back and forth, because the slave societies in the Caribbean influenced shaping slavery in New England. In fact, Massachusetts borrowed slave laws and customs governing slavery from the English West Indian colony of Barbados. Just directly lift the laws and put them on the books here, for example, or just use them as customs here. Some of the earliest graduates of Harvard University were the sons of planters from the West Indies. Leading merchant families from New England intermarried with the planter families from the West Indies. The New England leaders of the colony, John Winthrop, for example, sent sons to the West Indies as settlers to start plantations. And important for our story here, most enslaved people that arrived in New England at least spent some time in the Caribbean. Maybe a few days after stopping over coming from Africa. Sometimes they were even born there, as I'll talk about in a little bit. So using this Caribbean connection as a starting point, the book then in chapter 2 explores the way in which enslaved people arrived in New England. All told, about 20,000 enslaved Africans arrived between the 1630s and 1775. We have the best numbers for enslaved Africans, but there's also enslaved indigenous people that are trafficked into the region as well. By the 1770s, enslaved people came to comprise about 4% of the region's population. The thing is, though, that number is a bit misleading, because when you start looking at urban areas, say like Boston was 12 to 15% enslaved in the 18th century. Newport, Rhode Island, about 20 to 25% enslaved. So significant numbers of the population in these colonial, in the urban areas especially, were enslaved. White New Englanders eagerly embraced slave trading in all its many forms, from Africa, within the Caribbean, out of the Caribbean, as a form of commerce. And Rhode Island, especially, became the center of slave trading in all British North America, really all British America. You can take all the number of slave voyages from all the other 12 colonies that became the United States, and Rhode Island's adds up to more. They had more slaving voyages than all the other colonies combined. Became the center. But most important for this chapter, I dedicate the bulk of it to exploring the lives of 5 individuals trafficked into New England, and their stories and experiences of arriving here in the region and of being enslaved. And one of them, and this I might read a little bit from the book, of one of these men, his name was Mark. Standing on the gallows on the town common in Cambridge, Massachusetts in September 1755, Mark, a man who, quote, belonged to the late Captain John Codman of Charlestown, delivered a speech to the large crowd awaiting his execution. Sentenced to hang and have his dead body put on display for poisoning his master, Mark not only confessed to his crime and offered repentance, but provided a short biography of his life. According to his confession, Mark was born into slavery in Barbados, quote, sometime in the year of 1725. He was sold away from the island as a young boy, probably around the age of 8, when he could be put to work. That's about the age boys were put to work, to a succession of masters in New England. One, a brazier or a brass worker, whose name was Mr. Salter, was especially kind to Mark, and in Mark's words, quote, learned him to read and, quote, educated him as tenderly as one of his own children. Salter, however, must not have been that nice, as he then sold the enslaved boy to another master, who in turn sold him to Codman. Codman put Mark to work in the foundry on his property. Mark then toiled as a metal worker in Boston and Charlestown until he finally grew tired of Codman's abuse, and Codman was quite abusive, and murdered him. Mark's story helps to illustrate an important trend in New England slavery that is easy to overlook when discussing either transshipment or the transatlantic slave trade. Many of the slaves who arrived in New England were born in the Americas, namely the West Indies. Called Creoles would be the term for these folks. It should not be surprising that so many ended up in New England, given the region's close connection to the Caribbean. Potential slave owners would have preferred slaves like Mark. Fluent in English, Mark could learn more easily, learn a skill. Likewise, Mark would have been familiar with New World slavery, Anglo-American society, and British imperial networks. And so there's a real diversity in the enslaved population in New England. Creoles like Mark, Africans namely from the Gold Coast region of Africa and from the Senegambian region of Africa, but also enslaved indigenous people who come from the Carolinas in Florida that are really particularly awful slave trade there, that they're trafficked out of the region. And New Englanders are some of the main buyers. So this kind of diversity of arrivals to New England. From there, the book has 3 chapters exploring the institution of slavery in New England and the lives of enslaved people under the institution of slavery. These chapters look at topics like slave law, slave labor. By 1700, you could find enslaved people working in all parts of the New England economy, urban and rural. Almost every small frontier town oftentimes had 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 enslaved people living there, providing supplemental farm labor. But it was really the urban areas that most latched onto enslaved labor. And so places like Boston, its major industries of the 18th century, shipbuilding, distilling, rope making, these were driven by enslaved labor. Enslaved labor was absolutely central to the function of those institutions. And the relative economic growth of New England in the 18th century, it grows dramatically across the course of the 18th century, namely through those industries, cannot be understood without understanding the place of enslaved people in the economy. But it's not just in the urban areas where you see concentration. So for example, in southwestern Rhode Island, in what's called what was then called the Narragansett country, what's today Washington County, fertile farmland was oftentimes purchased up by wealthy landholders. They'd buy up thousands of acres of land, and they'd put dairy cattle on it, 100,000 head of dairy cattle. And they'd buy enslaved labor forces to work these dairy farms where they produce butter and cheese for export. So one of these dairy farms that belonged to the Hazard family of Rhode Island had about 50 enslaved people, about 1,000 acres of land, roughly the same number of head of cattle. And what's really interesting is that the enslaved workers were mostly women engaged in the dairying. There were about 10 men, it seems, who did kind of skilled tasks around the farm, or plantation, we could call it. And most of the dairying work was done by women. And this actually came to mirror the practice in Virginia or South Carolina or the West Indies, where most of the hard field work, cutting cane, taking care of rice and tobacco, that was done by women working in the fields, enslaved women, and that's the kind of labor form that took shape in southern Rhode Island, which I guess in some ways isn't surprising given the region's connection to the African slave trade and to those West Indian societies. We also see, however, the lived experience of slavery. We see the formation of families by enslaved people. We see the friendships they form. We see how they associate with one another and with other people in the community. And we see resistance to slavery. We talked about, as I spoke about Mark, with his the kind of poisoning of his master, but other forms of resistance as well, running away, breaking tools, feigning ignorance, the sort of what anthropologists would call the weapons of the weak that are used to resist their enslavement. And you can see all of this. And this is one of the unique things about slavery in New England, and in some ways what made the kind of what to write about easier in a book like this is because the records of slavery in New England are really, really rich. There's not just account books of plantation owners and a few letters that we have in say the southern colonies of the West Indies, but we have court records, account books, private letters and diaries, wills and probate inventories, and New England was the center of print culture in the American colonies. And so lots and lots of newspapers and other pieces of print, locally produced print, that talk about enslaved people, runaway ads, hiring out ads, for sale advertisements, and things like that we can really understand and get a good sense of what life was like for enslaved people. And one of those cases I document in the book is where we can see the relationship between an enslaved mother and her child, and how that enslaved woman kept African cultural traditions alive. The enslaved woman, her name is Jenny. A good example of this mother-child bond was Jenny. who was owned by the prominent Ashley family of Deerfield, Massachusetts. They were the ministers in town, the Ashleys. Jenny was from the Kingdom of the Congo in West Central Africa, and allegedly, according to her own testimony, the, quote, daughter of a king. When she was about 12 years old in the mid-1730s, she and some other children were playing near a well in the Congo. A, quote, gang of white villains ambushed the group, bound them, and rushed them on board a slave ship. The slavers were New Englanders. They kidnapped Jenny and sold her in Boston, where Jonathan Ashley, then Deerfield's minister, he was there visiting on business, purchased the enslaved girl. Family proved to be a cornerstone in Jenny's life. Years after being kidnapped and having a child of her own, someone in Deerfield asked about her capture. Telling the story of playing by the well and the, quote, white villains, she lamented that after being placed on board the ship, we never see our mothers anymore. As a mother, Jenny's sorrow of being ripped away from her own haunted her for the rest of her life. Jenny had a son named Cato. Little is known about Cato's birth date, her father, although Jonathan Ashley baptized the child in 1739. As a native of Africa, Jenny never fully acclimated to life in New England and passed many of her customs on to her son. Most importantly, as with many other enslaved Africans in the Americas, Jenny believed on her death that she would cross the ocean and return to her homeland. She prepared, quote, all kinds of odds and ends for her final passage. She passed these customs on to Cato. When he died in 1825, nearly a century after Jenny's arrival, the Ashleys discovered he had, quote, gathered trinkets to provide for his transition. So we could really, these are the sorts of stories, the sorts of things that are hidden in the records of New England that we can uncover to explore and understand the lives of enslaved people. The final chapter of the book explores the American Revolution and its impact on slavery. The Revolution was, in many ways, provided the impetus for ending slavery in New England for both ideological and economic reasons. More significantly, it created opportunities for enslaved people to strike out for their own freedom through activism, military service, or simply absconding, running away. I found some really remarkable statistics as part of this part of the book and researching it. If you take a look at the 1790 federal census for the state of Connecticut, you'll find that they list in all the census they list the race of the family and of the head of the household. And so if you look at all the black men that are heads of household in Connecticut, 20% of them were veterans of the Continental Army, and whose freedom could be linked to their service in the Army and service in the Revolution. And so this was a common way for especially enslaved men in New England to find their freedom during the Revolution, was service in the Continental Army. Enslaved men disproportionately served in the Continental Army in New England. New England enslaved men disproportionately served. In the southern colonies, they were more likely to serve in the British Army. Speaking of that, there's another story I uncovered about, because of course this was a conflict with two sides, and I uncovered the story of a man named Pompey Fleet. Actually, both Pompey Fleet and his father, whose name's Peter Fleet, and I'm happy to talk about him in the questions if you'd like. Pompey Fleet was enslaved to a man named Thomas Fleet Jr., who was a printer in Boston, and a patriot printer at that. Pompey Fleet appears in the records early on in relation to his father, but when he kind of appears in the first moments on his own, was actually a runaway ad. His master, Thomas Fleet, who owns a newspaper, so he puts out an ad in his own newspaper saying that Pompey has run away. He broke out of the Bridewell, which is the name for the town jail. What was an enslaved man doing in the jail? Well, it seems that New England slave owners would oftentimes rely on public institutions to restrain their bondsmen and women when they felt they could not. So it seems that he had been a bit recalcitrant, disobeyed Thomas Fleet, so he put him in jail. But Pompey broke out. He disappears from the records. We're not sure what happened. He appears again in 1783, this time in New York City. He appears in a document that is called the Book of Negroes. This is a document kept by the British Army when they evacuate New York, documenting all the now freed people of African descent that were leaving with the Army, who had joined the British lines and were leaving with the Army. And there's an entry for Pompey Fleet, and it says he escaped his master at the time of the evacuation of Boston. So when the British military left Boston in 1776, when they evacuated to go to Halifax, it seems that Pompey left with him, and also left with his wife and 2 children, if the documents to be trusted. While he was in New York City, we know he was working as a pressman. So he continued his job as a printer, working for a loyalist printer named Alexander Robertson, printing the Royal American Gazette. Robertson, after the war, relocated to Halifax, where he continued printing the Royal American Gazette, and it seems that Pompey Fleet continued working as a pressman. But in 1786, Robertson relocated to Prince Edward Island to set up a print shop there, and Pompey remained in Nova Scotia. Disappears from the records again until 1791. He shows up in a list of passengers to the newly founded colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa. This is a colony set up by the British for black loyalists, for freed slaves, to go resettle in West Africa, modern-day country of Sierra Leone. Pompey was on the ship. Circumstantial evidence suggests, and I honestly believe, but I have to say circumstantial in the book to get it through peer review, circumstantial evidence suggests that he became the first printer in Sierra Leone. So he set up a print shop. They have an active printer by 1793, and the only person with that skill set would have been Pompey Fleet. So he's actively a printer, so he takes that trade with him, and so he goes across the ocean and takes his trade with him from New England. So we see the different stories coming out of the Revolution and ways and opportunities for freedom. And for that reason, the chapter actually ends on a cautiously optimistic note, because by the mid-1780s, slavery had no legal standing in any of the New England states. Both Connecticut and Rhode Island had passed gradual emancipation laws. Massachusetts had court cases that had declared slavery incompatible with the Constitution of Massachusetts of 1780. So in theory, slavery had no legal standing. We saw enslaved people were rapidly becoming free, either through lawsuits, activism, running away. So in theory, enslaved people were rapidly becoming free. The region's slave trade had been abolished, in theory, through legal activity, and there were real possibilities. It seemed at the end of the conflict in 1783 and in the 1780s, real possibilities for freed people to become equal members of the new United States. Once again, in theory. The epilogue of the book is a bit less optimistic because it examines all of those in theories and puts them in context, demonstrating the ways enslaved and recently freed people were systematically denied their freedom, disenfranchised, segregated, and alienated from white New England society. One of the more insidious things I found in the course of the research, and I really tried, this is actually where I did some archival research and really tried to understand it, was something that historians call selling out. Between about 1760 and 1790, both enslaved people in New England, but also freed people were kidnapped and sold away from the colonies, and then later the New England states. Sold out to the West Indies, to the American South, and to Atlantic Canada was actually one of their major destinations for this process. The evidence is sparse because it was technically illegal, and so it's really hard to get at. But if you take a look at something like the Providence Abolitionist Society, the secretary of that was Moses Brown of the Brown family who founded Brown University. And he receives all these letters from leading New Englanders. So Jonathan Edwards, the great evangelist, his son, is writing to him. But also family members, friends, who worry that enslaved people they knew, freed people they knew, family members had been kidnapped and were being sold away, and for any help to try to locate them in this process. The numbers are really hard to get at, but between about 1760 and 1790, I estimate about 1,000 people were probably sold out of the region. If you think that in 1770, the population, the enslaved population in New England was about 17,000, that is a substantial number of people. And the evidence once again, kind of circumstantial evidence backs this up. So things like if you take a look at the newspapers in Atlantic Canada, you'll find runaway ads where they reference, they think the runaways tried to escape back to New England to get home. So that sort of evidence is there. So selling out is one of these kind of things that limits these opportunities for freedom, and it's something they all face. Another piece of evidence I found was in a notary book. There's a notary by the name of Ezekiel Price who's active in Boston from the 1740s until about 1791 when he passed away. He was a patriot. And he kept a notary book, so full of marine insurance entries and receipts and things things like that. In 1789, he recorded the manumission certificate of a man named Charlestown. And so he records it, that it's on record. If you look at the actual date of the document that Ezekiel Price did in 1789, Charlestown was actually freed in 1777. So here he is 12 years later registering his manumission certificate. And the only thing I could expect is he's worried if he loses that certificate, or if someone tries to kidnap him, he has this on file somewhere he can point to it, and Price is a kind of trusted member of the community that he can point to. And so what we really see are these kind of, and that story points to the kind of lost promises of the revolution, the lost promises of freedom. We see in the aftermath of the revolution the rise of racial segregation, especially in public institutions. So public schools across New England are segregated until about the time of the Civil War, and that was only through continuous black activism. But we also see marginalization from the labor force. In a place like Boston, enslaved people were incredibly skilled. They were blacksmiths, coopers, shipwrights, and in the aftermath of the war, for a variety of reasons, systematic racism, but also kind of some issues with working class rights and whites and kind of class conflict, they're completely locked out of the labor market. To the point that many freed people left New England entirely. So where I want to end is actually, I want to read a last passage because I want to talk about, well, what's happening in those white worlds as enslaved and recently freed people are being marginalized, denied the opportunities for freedom, kidnapped and sold out, locked out of the labor force. What's happening? As blacks left the region or struggled to eke out a living, New England's white population never faced the consequences for the sins of slavery. Rather, they enjoyed all the benefits of generations of slave ownership, with little regard for those who suffered under its yoke. Even sympathetic whites or enslavers who realized the errors of their ways benefited. As we've seen, poorer whites, many who never had owned slaves, embraced racism and the marginalization of people of color. Not only did that lessen competition in the job market, but it gave poor whites the psychological satisfaction of racial superiority. As slavery dwindled in New England, many whites, including those who owned slaves, began to define themselves as fundamentally different from other Americans, especially those in the South. New England was free soil, so rich in liberty that slavery could never take deep root. Slavery, this line of thought went, was never important to the New England economy, was only practiced by a few wealthy families, and was largely a benevolent institution. Most importantly, white New Englanders realized the errors of their ways during the American Revolution and abolished slavery forever. In crafting this narrative of a free New England, whites absolved themselves of the sins of slavery. Such a belief system allowed for whites to shift away the blame for black poverty and immiseration away from the legacies of slavery and onto individual moral failings. Under this logic, if people could not thrive in a land of liberty and opportunity, they had no one to blame but themselves. White New Englanders, in short, made slavery and its legacies history. And it's that facet that reverberates across time and to us today, and where I'm going to end this evening. The ability of white New Englanders to totally distance themselves from slavery and yet continually benefit from that enslavement helped craft many of the myths about slavery in New England. That slavery was economically unimportant. Only a few people were enslaved, and slavery never really took root here. Morally superior New Englanders saw the errors of their way and quickly abolished what had been a benevolent slavery, if such a thing could ever exist. Or perhaps worst of all, slavery never existed in New England, or at least not a slavery that most Americans would recognize as such. And my hope is, at the very least, that this book is able to confront and help fight against these myths. Thank you very much.
You're saying that during the Revolution in the North, there was a disproportionate number of enslaved people who fought for the North?
Well, not for the Revolution, fought for the Continental Army.
Fought for the Colonial Army. And then what was the flip of that? Down in the South, they were
mostly fought for the British. Yeah, they took up arms for the British. By the end of the war, the British are actually offering enslaved people their freedom for joining the British Army. But in the North, George Washington, remember the war starts here, and George Washington starts here. At first, he's quite reluctant, but the Continental Army has such a need for manpower by 1777 that they're openly recruiting black soldiers, and oftentimes in exchange for their freedom. Rhode Island, for example, raises what's called the Rhode Island First, an entire regiment of black soldiers who gained their freedom in exchange for fighting in the Continental Army. So yeah, it's a really important process. There's an interesting, and the Massachusetts State Archives, they're not cataloged, or they weren't as of about 8 years ago, so I could be wrong now. All of these petitions of the state paying, compensating enslavers for their enslaved person's service in the military, so they get their freedom, but the enslavers still compensated. There's also quite a few petitions, it seems, that enslaved people ran away to the army, and then they're filing petitions to try to recover their property, but the state will refuse because the Continental Army, because so the way the Continental Army worked is that states the levies were placed on the states to raise so many soldiers, and so they had to meet those demands. And so enslaved men who were ready and willing to fight for their freedom, they were enlisted into the ranks. So yeah, the Continental Army is integrated. And of course, the United States military won't be integrated again until after World War II, until the Korean War. So yeah, so the Continental Army is an integrated fighting force. And the black men that served in the Continental Army were disproportionately from New England.
You were talking very early on about especially in New England, the taking over the native land, pushing out indigenous people, some of whom were enslaved. But it made me start wondering, I hadn't really thought about this, why didn't they just enslave indigenous people rather than bringing in African slaves?
That's an excellent question. So it relates to, at the very basic, indigenous people know the land. So easier to run away, easier to hide within their communities. So let's say the Pequot, who were universally disliked by other indigenous people in the region as well. So the Narragansett, the Mohegan, and the Massachusetts, and the Wampanoag actually fought alongside the colonists against the Pequot. Even then, you see, actually, the Pequot that were captive here oftentimes would run away into like Mohegan communities, and the Mohegans would hide them from their masters. So that's the big reason, is that it's hard to keep a captive labor force who knows the landscape. But there's the thing is that enslaved bodies, these captives, were a valuable commodity to a place like the West Indies that has a really high demand for labor. And so it's valuable if you're trying to purchase, say, sugar or molasses or something like that. You see this actually during King Philip's War. So I talked about the Pequot War, but during King Philip's War, at least 2,000 indigenous captives are sold out of New England. So many, in fact, that both the colony of Barbados and the colony of Jamaica passed laws banning the further importation of New England Indians. Because most of them are warriors, they're seen as causing they can cause all sorts of problems and uprisings and things, especially if you have a significant concentration of them. So yeah, so it's both the sort of the concerns about knowing the land, but also what historians would call the process of commodification, that the body itself is worth something in this system of trade. Yeah. And I should make note that this is a very deliberate thing. This is not haphazard, right? They don't, capture a bunch of Pequot warriors and say, oh, let's sell them and acquire Africans. It's quite deliberate. In 1645, there's a letter from a man named Emmanuel Downing, who was a magistrate in Salem, and the brother-in-law of John Winthrop. And John Winthrop's the recipient of the letter. And in the letter, there had been some diplomatic problems between the Narragansett and the New England colonies. Downing advocated a preemptive war with the Narragansett. What they would call legally a just war, right? Because they're not Christians, and so they're able to wage just war. And as part of just war, under the doctrine, the law of just war, you're allowed to capture and sell the captives as slaves. He advocates just war, or this war, a preemptive war, which would be legally just war in Downing's formulation, to capture Narragansetts, but not to put them to work in New England, to sell them to the West Indies, to acquire, as he said, he called them Moors, Africans. And the reason for that was Downing was really worried. He was watching, he's in Salem, in Essex County, the towns are expanding rapidly. He's really worried about what are New England farmers going to do for workers, because none of the kids will want to stay and work on their family farm when they can acquire land. None of the young indentured servants they bring, once they get their freedom, they're not going to stick around on their former master's land. They're going to move and acquire their own land, or they're going to move into the cities and perform their trade. So he's really worried about where do we get a labor force to continually operating the places that have already been settled. And so he said, well, what if we wage a preemptive war against the Narragansett? We capture them and we can trade them for 20. He says he said we can trade one Indian captive for 20 Moors. I don't think his math was quite right. But he also makes the argument that Africans are cheaper to maintain because i.e. we could treat them worse than we do white indentured servants or our children. Yeah.
Has the role of indentured servitude just been overblown to sort of mask the role of slavery, or was there a blurring of lines between indentured servitude and slavery that then got solidified sometime in the mid-17th century?
There's indentured servants to New England, so there are indentured servants that arrive with the initial Puritan settlers. They're all free by about 1640. The thing is, this is a Puritan colony. Indentured servants are different from enslaved people in a lot of ways. The first thing is it's their time that is owned, not their bodies. So you own them for a certain set of years. The other thing about indentured servants is they, in theory, have a choice of where they go. So if you're an English person, most indentured servants were young Englishmen, and you had your choice of where to go circa 1640 or 50, you don't want to go to Puritan New England, especially if you're not a Puritan. They don't like outsiders anyways. They already have a reputation for being intolerant. So the colony has a really hard time attracting indentured servants, whereas Virginia, work your 7 years, you get your land. The West Indies attract at first a lot of indentured servants. No, very quickly you begin to see an uptick in indentured servitude again by the 18th century, but this is by then the Puritan kind of class has fallen, and there are some more kind of opportunities in New England to acquire land or acquire a trade or something like that. But no, there's very little indentured servitude, especially in the 17th century. And so the bulk of bound labor in New England is either at first bound indigenous people, but by about 1680s or 90s, it's African.
Timeliness of the book is partly related to the interest that seems to be rising here. And I'm curious, in your conversations with people, in the reading that you do, especially in your research as a historian, how much do you think that interest is a genuine interest in reconciliation and reparation versus looking like good white people?
That's a really good question. I'm deeply at the end of the day a cynic. And so I do think, so I'll give the example, because I'm not going to be cynical, actually, and I'm going to give the example. I've been working quite a bit with the Old North Church about confronting their own history of slavery and enslavement, and they seem genuinely interested in confronting this past, acknowledging it past, and figuring out ways to some sort of recompense for it. But that's coming out of their faith tradition, right? They see that this was very much, we had a panel last night talking about this, and it was very much centered in their faith tradition. This is an honest belief that and it creates a thirst for a knowledge, because that sort of knowledge having that will then allow them to sort of confront this past and begin to think about ways of fixing it, or not fixing it, you cannot fix it, but to address it. So I do think there is quite a bit of a kind of a genuine interest in this, and trying to figure out the ways in which the institutions and the people that we sort of revere in New England, their ties to slavery, recognizing that and trying to address it. So I do think there is a genuineness, but I also do think that there's some of the other, as you suggested. Yeah.
I was under the impression that the sum total of Africans who fought in the colonial period were primarily fighting on the British side. So can you clarify that? And
Yes.
The second part is, can you talk about, did literacy laws change after the 1740s with the Stoner Rebellion and in the South, they made literacy illegal
Yes.
for Africans?
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that played out in the New England.
Oh, absolutely. So to the first question, the vast majority of African Americans, and most of them were African Americans, served in the British. Because that was concentrated in the South, there were a lot more enslaved Africans there. And so, so the vast majority of Africans that served for the British side, but in the Continental Army. So in the American side, the vast majority were black enslaved New Englanders. So that's the kind of difference. But the vast majority served in the South. Literacy is an interesting point, because New Englanders, coming out of their religious traditions, they wanted to Christianize. And to be a good Protestant, you have to be able to read the Bible, whether you're a Puritan or an Anglican or there's Huguenot churches and things here, all sorts of denominations. And so there is actually a focus on teaching enslaved people to read the Bible. And it seems to only increase in time, even after some of the slave rebellions in the West Indies in the 1730s and the Stono Rebellion in the late 1730s. You don't see that kind of reaction. There's never really a slave rebellion here in New England, though. So there is this continual kind of push for literacy. These people aren't dumb, right? So they know the consequences of teaching someone to read the Bible means they can read anything else. And it does seem at one point Cotton Mather, the kind of theologian, also was teaching them to write. And so what this does, it creates an incredibly literate enslaved population. I mean, in my first book about Boston, I argue that enslaved Bostonians are probably the most literate enslaved population in the English-speaking world. And that equips them with all sorts of tools. Looking at Belinda Sutton's petition on the wall, they become experts at petitioning, for example, and beginning in the 1720s and 30s and 40s, 50s, but by the 1770s, really close to the Revolution, enslaved and free blacks in Boston and across the state are actually drafting petitions demanding their freedom from the legislature. We have 7 of these petitions, and that's enabled by literacy, and they're reading newspapers. We know, for example, enslavers would not put the names of their enslaved people they're selling in the newspaper, because enough enslaved people could read, they would tell each other who was for sale. So you see, beginning about the 1730s, the names of the enslaved person drops. It's just for sale, an able-bodied Negro man. That's what the ad said. Inquire of the printer. They wouldn't even list the master's name. Inquire of the printer, so they would know who was going to be sold. So yeah, so this literacy becomes a really powerful tool and so you also see the emergence of a strong black intellectual tradition in New England by the 1760s and 70s. It's really interesting that they did not seem to have the qualms about literacy as, say, in the major slave societies of the West Indies or the South.
Talk about how we got from being a religiously founded colony, city on the hill, to enslaved flavor.
Yeah, I mean, it's very quick, right? I mean, it's settled in, Massachusetts Bay Company is founded, 1626? There's enslaved people documented here by 1638. I think, there's these sort of pragmatic concerns that very quickly confront that vision of a city on a hill. There's really, the one biggest issue for, say, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, is what if it fails? What if the city on the hill fails? And so you have to have a vibrant, robust economy, but you don't produce anything that anybody really wants, except for these slaveholders in the West Indies. I mean, John Winthrop's writing about this by the mid-1630s, like we can provision these growing sugar plantations. That is, and so very quickly there's kind of pragmatic questions of how do we sustain the colony, which they would also argue that's part and parcel, and historians have shown this, part and parcel of the religious mission, because building new churches, building new towns, that's really expensive. You need money to do that. And so that means having a sort of a vibrant, functional economy that gets tied into slavery, but then you confront these labor shortages, and so, it's almost two different worlds. It doesn't always match up. And this is there's a historian named Mark Peterson who just wrote a book called The City-State of Boston, about Boston and its kind of vision of itself from the 1630s until the 1860s. And he said that they always kind of envisioned themselves as the city on the hill, as this kind of commonwealth, as this place of freedom, while they increasingly entangled themselves in slavery. Time and time again, whether it's the West Indies in the 17th century, the slave trade in the 18th century, and the West Indies in the 18th century, or buying cotton in the 19th century from the American South. And so they always find themselves entangled in these kind of morally, and they know it, but it doesn't stop them. And they're so sort of, as I said, they're so sort of deliberate about engaging in these acts as well. Yeah. Yes.
In Brookline, we have maps of properties from the different times of the 1700s. And having done research on slave owners and slavery in Brookline, one day I started coloring in, and over half of the land was held by enslaving families. And that's a very different way of looking at
Yes.
it than saying 3%
Yes.
of the population was enslaved.
Yeah.
Because if you say 3%, it sounds unusual.
Yes. It sounds, yes.
If you say over half the land, maybe 60% of the land. So I'm wondering what you think of coming forward with that first, and if other towns have those kind of maps where you could do that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the way to do it, and this has been done, right? Brookline is a good example of that. I did it in Boston with my first book. 25% of households owned slaves in Boston in the 18th century. It's been done in Deerfield. Historic Deerfield's done a really good job at this as well. I mean, here's a town of 500 or so people in the 18th century, and they have 50 slaves living there. So yeah, when you start, yeah, you're right. When you start actually breaking out what you don't just say an overall number, but when you start looking at individual localities, urban areas or these rural areas that support urban areas, that really, like Brookline, it does tell a very different story. When I say 4%, that's a narrative device, right? Because then I want to break that down and kind of deconstruct what that actually means. But you're absolutely right. I think that's where the work is to be done. And so much, as I said, of this book comes out of the work of activists, local historians, public historians, independent researchers who are doing that type of work that really shows. The work on Deerfield, for example, was done by a retired physicist who works at Historic Deerfield. And that work is really the sort of backbone of better understanding slavery in New England, I think. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you for your presentation. You heightened my curiosity about this understanding of Bostonians as being the black enslaved Bostonians as being literate, and arguably more literate than others.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, they were no rebellion, right? And when I listen to your story, this idea of terror, trauma, violence, it's not shaping Bostonian slavery in the same way, arguably, that it's shaped in the South.
Yes.
So now you have this tension, because if Douglas is right, that somehow literacy becomes a tool by which you fight for your freedom, and now slavery becomes unmanageable. How can you explain Boston having this intellectual elite culture, and yet they're less resistant to?
Yes.
So how do you think through this, how literacy plays out?
No, that's an most excellent question. Yeah, so the Douglas, you gave me an inch, I took an L, right? The famous Douglas line where he talks about this. No, you're absolutely correct. That you would think a more literate enslaved population would lead to a more rebellious enslaved population. But what if we redefine rebellion? What if, they use that literacy to file petitions to have their grievances addressed, to file lawsuits against their masters? These are all things that sit in the archives. The problem with kind of open rebellion in a place like Boston, where enslaved people are 12 to 15% of the population, is they're vastly outnumbered. And they would be quickly kind of put down. They're always being, Boston's a town of 17,000 people. Everybody knows everybody's business. The newspapers don't print local news because everyone knows everybody's business. And so and it also, you kind of bring up the issues of trauma and terror and things like that. It also functions a bit differently in New England. It's the constant surveillance. It's, most households own one enslaved person. So the kind of psychological, the psychological effects of being kind of separated and alienated and kind of marginalized in a household, that's the sort of trauma and terror of New England slavery. And so it's a little different. There's plenty of violence too. Mark is a good example of that. But there's also the sort of the psychological effects, the surveillance. And so that also then reshapes the nature of resistance, which it becomes about using those tools. And resistance is much more subtle. It's about kind of carving out autonomy, finding independence. And then when this moment presents itself in the 1760s and 70s, the coming of the revolution, that's when you see this big push for freedom, the embrace of, say, natural rights discourse and all that, this emergence of a black intellectual tradition that really embraces those things. Yeah.
Did you get any sense of the relationships between indigenous peoples who were enslaved and Africans and African Americans who were enslaved?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of that. So that's a really excellent question. So the first thing is that all the New England colonies have banned indigenous slavery by 1700. It's banned. They in theory, in practice, there's debt peonage and things like that. What you really see is beginning about the 1740s and 50s and into the early 19th century is the extensive intermarriage of African Americans with indigenous communities in New England, especially African American men. In a place like Boston, Boston is 2/3 male. Its enslaved population is 2/3 male. This is an industrial city, shipbuilding, rope making, distilling. They want men there to work, and so so 2/3 of the enslaved population is male. What if they want a wife? Well, as it turns out, many of the indigenous communities are actually disproportionately female. Because under this sort of treaties in which the indigenous groups were subjugated by the colonies, the men have to serve in the army. So they go off to war in the many imperial wars of the 18th century, and they die in combat. They're sailors, they're whalers, and they die at sea in shipwrecks. And so indigenous communities are majority female. Now, that's not to suggest that demographics are destiny. But you do see an extensive intermarriage between the two, and not to once again deny sort of romantic love, because there seems to be evidence of that as well. But for an enslaved man, an indigenous woman is an excellent partner. She's free, so his children would be free. She has access to tribal land, so his children would have access to tribal land. So there's a sort of generational calculation. You also see enslaved men will also marry free black women for largely the kind of same reasons, have access to freedom. And so there's been a lot of studies on this. Actually, the majority of literature looks at from the perspective of the indigenous women. My research is more focused on the perspective of the men. And yeah, so there's extensive intermarriage, and to the point that by if you read so all the reservations in Massachusetts are assigned a guardian from this kind of colonial and later state official that kind of oversees the reservations. The guardians can't distinguish the races. They can't figure out the populations are so intermixed. They can't figure out who's African, who's Indian. And it seems that in some ways this is a deliberate strategy. So we think about someone like Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey was a leading African American merchant. He was a sailor, a landowner, very wealthy by the early 19th century. His mother was Pequot. And if you read his early kind of activism during the American Revolution, when he first appears in the town records, on the one hand, he'll be at the protest demanding civil rights for African Americans. On the other hand, at one point, he's jailed for not paying taxes because he claims that because he's Indian, he's exempt from taxes. So they play with their identity. That kind of intermixture allows them to kind of play with their identity to latch on to advocating for different sets of rights and for different to move through society. It seems to be a fairly deliberate strategy. Yeah, so extensive intermixture. Yeah.
Your research came up with any link between the establishment of the colonial charters, particularly the Mass Bay Charter, but also Harvard later, and the acquisition of land and the enslavement of Black Africans.
So
whether there was any connection, like whether that made it possible to acquire more land, enslave more people, how that kind of played out, whether it was deliberate and what impacts did it have to that economy.
So you're saying like these institutions are chartered and they deliberately purchase enslaved people to.
Right, because now they don't owe it to the king anymore; they have it for themselves.
Yeah. So that you see occasionally, the more common, you don't actually see, say, the institutional ownership of enslaved people. What you do see, though, is the extensive use of enslaved labor, so hiring artisans and things like that. I don't know if that really answers your question, but if you mean like, I'm trying to think. And you also see it in ways of like trustees will sell enslaved people, then donate the proceeds to the institutions. That sort of, so it's not a direct tie where institutions are actually owning enslaved people. You do see all these kind of supplemental ways in which the money from enslavement's flowing into these institutions in different ways, and usually through kind of private philanthropy would be,
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. You said the slave laws for Barbados and other West Indian plantation areas were sort of superposed here, sort of adopted them. And I was wondering what kinds of things that included, and did it include strict separation of white and black, for example, or what
Yeah.
all?
Yeah, so the Barbadian slave law of 1661 is the first comprehensive slave code in the English-speaking world. And it's copied across everywhere. South Carolina, Jamaica, Virginia copies parts of it. And so Massachusetts copies parts of it too. And so you see this in kind of interesting ways. The first is, you see the passage of anti-miscegenation laws in 1705 in Massachusetts. So that's one of the first things you see that comes out of that. The kind of the sorts of punishments that are used against enslaved people also comes out of the ways you can punish enslaved people. But some parts of it aren't adopted. For example, you can't murder an enslaved person in Massachusetts, which it was legal to do in Barbados. Your own property. You can murder your own enslaved person. But the most interesting case I found is actually this principle that's called partus, or it's short for a Latin term, partus sequitur ventrinum, which means that children follow the status of their mother. This allows for hereditary slavery. It makes enslavement generational. The children follow the status of their mother, so if the mother's enslaved, the child is, and they're on. It's never on the books in any of the New England colonies, but it's custom. They've copied it from Barbados. It's never actually in the books, but it's there. It's present and it's copied. They're looking to what's happening in Barbados especially, and they're saying we're just going to copy that here. Yeah. So there is hereditary slavery in New England, but there's not actually a law that upholds it. They're using the sort of custom of the customary practice of slavery to uphold this central tenet of it. Which is one of the reasons, legally speaking, why slavery was so easy to end in New England, because there's not a lot of actual law that upholds it. But as historians have shown, not having law is actually almost as useful as having comprehensive slave laws, because it allows enslavers to kind of do whatever they want with their property. Because so much about slavery is about power. It's about the control you have over the body of the person, not about what the law says in an ethereal sense.